Downtown in Business was in Westminster this week as Rachel Reeves delivered the new government's first budget and announced a whopping £40 billion in extra taxes. We reflect on the fallout from Labour's first fiscal event in 15 years. The interminable Tory leadership race finally reached its conclusion at the weekend, and Kemi Badenoch was crowned as the leader of the opposition, as the sixth Conservative Party leader in 9 years. How long will she survive? And as we are just 24 hours away from the most consequential US presidential election since, well, the last one, we look across the pond and give our predictions as to what the result may be in this momentous US election. I'm Frank McKenna. This is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just looks like bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Well, welcome back to the Downtown Den and our politics podcast for this week, where I am joined as ever by the wonderful, the fantastic, the amazing former BBC political editor for the Northwest, Jim Hancock, who apparently has been a victim of bullying, but we'll get into that a little later on. And one of the bullies, Joe Phillips, who is former advisor to Paddy Ashdown, also worked with Bob Geldof, and offers us quite an alternative, I was told, on Wednesday, political insight. I was told, Joe, by some of our colleagues on the terrace that they find your commentary just that little bit quirky, a little bit different, very much appreciated.
Oh, well,
and
that's good.
Whilst we're talking about the Westminster
eccentric's another word.
Eccentric, and there's nothing wrong with eccentric. There's ask Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, got them a long way.
Oh, please don't put me in that category.
So let me just talk about our wonderful parliamentary reception on Wednesday evening, because before we get into the business of the budget, we had about 100 business leaders there from mostly Liverpool, but from other cities as well. There were people in the room from Manchester, from Birmingham, from London. And it was a very lively group of people. And Joe, probably the first time you've met many of them. But it was good, wasn't it? It was good to see so many people down there and getting engaged in politics in a very, very real way.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, no, I have met many of them before, Frank, at the various Downtown in Business conferences and things.
You see, I always forget, you see, even though you've only been with us a couple of years, you're bloody ubiquitous, Joe, aren't you, at Downtown?
I know. Stuff? Quirky and ubiquitous. What could be worse? No, I thought it was great. And I thought, what was really interesting, because as you know, I went on to then go and do various broadcasts later on that day, but I thought it was really interesting to see the reaction. I know it was only a snapshot as soon as Rachel Reeves sat down, but from the business leaders, from Steve Rotherham, from various other people, Joe Henny from Nugent, and various other industry leaders, if you like, that they were much more pragmatic, much more sensible, recognise what Rachel Reeves was trying to do. And it was almost like you walked out of the building and everybody was going, oh, it's a disaster, it's dreadful, it's awful. And I thought nothing indicated more or illustrated more the Westminster bubble than the fact that everybody saying it was a disaster was based in Westminster, apart from the farmers, obviously, but everybody else was going, actually, this is okay, this is not bad, we can work with this. But I always say this, Frank, and it's not just buttering you up. There is a real sense of can do that exists outside of London, particularly at local government and business level. And I know there are different challenges, and I know there are different issues and all of that sort of stuff. And I can't remember who it was on Wednesday who actually spoke about, the land that is available to do things around Liverpool. Well, that just doesn't exist around London, for instance. But there is that sense of people working together. And, if you look at it, stand on the terrace of the House of Lords, as we were, and you look across and you've got Lambeth, Wandsworth, 32 boroughs in London, including the City of London. It's absolutely bonkers because they don't really work together. They say they do, but they don't. But what always comes across to me from your events is that people do work together. They might have different opinion, but they care very much about their region and about their area. And I think that comes through. So I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I enjoyed the event on the day, but also the dinner the night before, where we had sponsors and we had Liam Robinson, the leader of the City Council, speaking. And again, I think that there's a renewed confidence in Liverpool in terms of that new leadership that's in place now, both of the city and then Steve Rotherham obviously heading up the combined authority. And I felt that there was an air of confidence, Jim, in that room on Wednesday. It was almost as if they were looking for the good news. It was a glass half full room, if I can put it that way.
Yes. It was excellent, and having Liam Robinson and Steve Rotherham there symbolised the way in which they're working together, because those two tiers of local government working together is really essential. And references to Manchester, but not silly rivalry, because that's another thing that's been built up now, that the two city regions are working together. So all that was a good thing. And also the fact that, of course, we had the budget going on, and they were able to give their instant reactions to it. And Joe's outlined the positive elements of it. When we come on to analyse the budget, I have a slightly different view about Rachel Reeves's package, but they were certainly going to make the best of it. And, some fantastic people there. Particular mention for Alex Cousins of the wonderful organisation Catapult. It was really nice to meet her. She's a regular listener to this podcast and has views about the way in which one of the members of the team are treated. But good morning to you, Alex, as you listen to this.
Yeah, apparently Alex was saying to Joe and I that we bully James, and we can only apologise, Alex, but some people deserve bullying.
Exactly.
And on occasion, Jim does come out with the most outlandish of views, and we just need to put him back in his box occasionally. No, but it's good to have regular listeners such as Alex, and as I say, there are a few other people on the terrace who were complimenting us on the podcast, so thank you very much for that. From our perspective, can I just say, as an organisation, two things actually. The team, Alice, who produces the podcast, and also Beth, Casey, Chris, who were there on the day as well, did a fantastic job in terms of making sure that everything went very, very smoothly. And then, of course, we had a number of sponsors, all of whom you can see in the show notes this week. If you want to link to the people who helped us put that event on, supported that event. The two headline sponsors were the Liverpool Big Company, Bill Addy and his team, and Muse and Phil Marsden and the team there, who were very supportive of the event. So a great day all around as far as that aspect of it was concerned. Now, were those 100 business leaders as though walking out of Westminster on air, or were they going to the nearest boozer to drown their sorrows? That is the question. Rachel Reeves was facing a hell of a task because she'd inherited what she was describing as a 22 to 40 billion pound black hole, and depending on whose figures you believe, then she's not too far of the mark, I think it's fair to say. She was also inheriting an economy that for the past 30 years has invested less than any other G7 economy in its infrastructure and its public services. And that probably started to really bite during the Osborne austerity years. And I don't think we pay enough attention to the damage that Osborne did back in 2010 to 2016. And then also she was able to point to the fact that other than Germany, we are the worst performing member of the G7 in economic terms as well. And we all know, don't we, about the infrastructure the challenges that we have, the lack of investment in our schools, in our roads, in our rail network. So a big task for her. And she's raised, as I mentioned in my introduction, £40 billion in additional revenue. She's also loosened the purse strings as far as borrowing is concerned, which will give us some ability to invest in some of those infrastructure projects I've mentioned. And then, and she referenced this in her speech, of course, she's secured about £63 billion at the recent International Investment Summit. So against that backdrop, Jim, you were sort of suggesting that there were a few things in there that you thought were maybe a little bit sour tasting for business and others.
I'll try and rattle through my pluses and minuses. I think, broadly speaking, whether the Office of Budget Reforms fully supported the £22 billion black hole or not, the Tories contest that. But certainly, as you've outlined, she was left with an extremely difficult inheritance. I mean, for instance, there was no attempt apparently to fund the blood and post office huge compensation bills there. Nothing left in the books to do that. I mean, that's something that everybody can understand as a almost fraudulent way of behaving by the Conservative government. So I take on board the black hole argument. Also, you're quite right to address the double header of the infrastructure summit the week before, because it has brought in a lot of money, and it's quite clear the government are going to support aerospace, electric vehicles, the modern technologies, green industries, 10-year infrastructure projects, all taken care of, and a promise that debt will be falling at the end of the period. The income tax freeze is also going to end in 2028. That's quite good politics, because you can see the plan is to give the bad information now, and then income tax freeze ends in 28. Hopefully the economic recovery is taking place, leading up to a virtuous circle for the next general election. But my reservations are, on the question of trust, I'm afraid if you say we are not going to raise national insurance and put in some sort of sneaky little, it's a bit like those gabbling conditions that are put at the end of commercials on commercial radio, only after 11 o'clock and only when supplies can do, I think the charge of deception on the question of national insurance does stick. I am concerned at what I'm hearing about business being stifled to some extent. The markets have, Rachel Reeves went to great trouble to try and stabilize the markets, and this sign that they have to some extent, but there are some signs of increased borrowing. Local government's got a pittance. Social care has been ignored once again. 22 billion for the National Health Service without the conditions. I hope Wes is going to get these conditions imposed. Fuel duty frozen. Petrol's gone down by about 20p a litre. Now was the time to actually raise some revenue there rather than hitting some of these other people. And I do think, and the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry it's such a long answer, it's going to be intriguing, given the size of the Labour majority, the large number of rural seats that these MPs occupy on very thin majorities, very inexperienced Labour MPs. When the farmers start to get their tractors circling the constituency offices, it's going to be very interesting how these Labour MPs react to what's going to be a formidable campaign by the farmers, whether we agree it or not. Sorry for a long answer, Frank, but I thought I'd start off with a comprehensive review.
Well, it was a near 80-minute speech that Rachel Reeves delivered, so it was quite a pithy summary, Jim, to be fair to you. Joe, what were your thoughts?
Well, I think overall, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with Jim, because I'd hate to be accused of bullying him. I think the things that came out for me were the things that didn't cost a fortune, but are going to be pretty life-changing. And I wrote it in my blog last week. The carers, people who are caring for somebody else at home, they can actually now earn £45 more a week before their benefits are impacted. And we've seen terrible stories of people being sort of taken to the cleaners for being a penny over the limit. That's a huge, huge thing. Minimum wage, really important. Everybody said the sky would fall in the first time it was introduced. Well, actually, surprise, surprise, it didn't. Fuel duty, yes, really odd to do that and at the same time take the cap off bus fares, because you actually would have got more in from fuel duty than you are from bus fares, and buses are, as we know, used by poorer people, older people and young people who can't drive. I do think it came across that it was a budget where she had listened to people. And I think things like, retaining the business rates relief for retail, hospitality and leisure is important. I think the fact that very small businesses won't be impacted by the employer's national insurance increase and those sort of things are hugely important. But there were lots and lots of little things in there, like, the miners' pensions. That's been a campaign going on for years and years and years. Money for Holocaust education. It might not be a lot, but it's something that people have been campaigning for. As Jim rightly said, the contaminated blood and the post office scandals, of course, we have to pay those. And that should have been factored in at the very beginning. But just on the farming point, now, as you know, I come from a farming family. And I do think that the government has got a chance here to go, okay, we're using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. There is no doubt that there are an awful lot of very wealthy people who buy up agricultural land. They don't farm it. They don't even necessarily live in this country. And they are clearly not farmers. They are using it as a tax vehicle, a tax efficiency vehicle, shall we say, to be kind. And I think there is a way of saying, okay, we hear you. What we'll do is we will make sure that people who are actually farming, because at the moment all you have to do is to tick a box in a form, what you actually do is, okay, you are actually farming. That means it's a working farm. Therefore, you are exempt up to, even if they made it to 2 million, which sounds a lot, but isn't really, because the worry is that if family farms get sold off, they will be sold to developers. And that then means, you're going to have the whole argument about the green belt, and there is a whole issue about food security. But overall, I thought it was a good budget. I thought she delivered it very well. I thought she had a couple of very good jokes, not least of all aimed at Rishi Sunak and the £450 hike on private jets. And I have to say, it's a real shame that MPs don't stay around to listen, because I watched Ed Davies' response and it was very measured. It was constructively critical, but welcomed the measures. The carers is one thing that he'd campaigned for. And I just think, really, it's a really important thing. I know MPs are busy and they've all got to go and talk to their local radio and everything else, but actually do a little bit of courtesy and listen to the other parties as well.
Yes, I couldn't agree more as far as that last point is concerned. And I thought Rishi Sunak's response, although he came across a little angry, was a good response. And
I thought it was the best speech. I thought it was the best speech he'd made. His final speech was really fiery and putting his points over. It was fantastic.
Yeah, he's really pissed off over that private jet tax and also his wife getting hit by the non-dom thing as well. It was a double whammy for Rishi. It was personal for him. You could see that in his reaction. A lot to unpick there, and I think overall we're saying positive. I think, the glass half full reaction from that audience, the downtown parliamentary reception, was shared, I guess, by most voters. Although I do have to say, our media appear to just be on this absolute discourse of what can we do to bring the next government down? Where's the next crisis coming from for our country? They were almost orgasmic, some of the commentators, after when the markets took the smallest of hits, by the way, in terms of a reaction to a budget. And then it all settled down at the weekend, and nobody's commented on the fact that actually she's done a good job as far as the market's concerned. But on the sort of Wednesday evening and the Thursday morning, I found a bit sickening, actually, to see, and I'm not talking about the GB Newses of this world, who you would anticipate would be coming out and saying it was all, we're going to hell in a handcart. This was people on Sky News and people within the mainstream media saying, oh, look at this, borrowing costs are going up, the pound's gone down. And it was just so negative. And you're right, Joe. They, I think, have got themselves in this awful mess of being caught up in the psychodrama that was created by Boris Johnson, Brexit and co, but is now being fueled by a media that is it's lost its way, I think, mainstream media. I think every question starts with, oh, well, we've caught you here, we've got you. Here we go again. You're telling lies. No wonder the public trust in politicians is as low as it is, because they don't get any breaks. Now, there was no context to the questioning that Rachel Reeves faced by, and I'd extend this not just to the mainstream media that we would ordinarily associate that phrase with, but podcasters as well. John Sopel and Emily Maitlis giving Rachel Reeves a torrid time. And I just wonder whether, the political discourse in this country can ever get to the place where we're having mature conversations about things like, well, if you want good public services, you've got to pay for them. Things like immigration. Things like, how do we support businesses without saying that we've got to be bloody Singapore on sea? Because despite the 40 billion tax increases, do you know we're still one of the lowest tax countries in the developed world? So I just don't know where all this negativity was coming from, Jim. And as a journalist, I just wonder what your thoughts are in the way in which the budget has been covered.
I don't share your concern about this. I think it was a breathtaking budget, and I mean, fair enough. It did signal that I think one of the reasons for the sort of commentary that you're commenting on came through was that in the build up to the general election, they were doing everything. Labour was doing everything it could to portray itself as a business friendly, just left of centre, nothing to worry about here. And when you actually look at the budget, obviously you've referred to the particular things of private school VAT and jets and things like that. Those are the sort of class warfare tweaks of the budget. But more fundamentally, we do have a Labour government that believes in a bigger state and higher taxes, certainly for the time being, than Tony Blair did. And so the arrival again of the sort of 1970s Labour government.
I get that, Jim, but Jim, I'm not arguing the fact that this was a relatively speaking radical budget. I mean, again, I think, as you both said, she could have gone further. She could have done fuel duty for a start. But what I am suggesting, Jim, is there was no run on the pound. There was no spooking of the markets. We weren't in Liz Truss territory. We were a million miles away from that. And yet commentators on the Wednesday evening and Thursday morning were trying to pretend that that narrative was a reasonable narrative to offer. And I just think that our journalists are starting to get into the place where, unless there's a cabinet member who you can go after, or a scandal over here, or all the country's in crisis, they can't cope. They can't cope with coming out and saying, well, this is a little bit radical, but, it's what the Labour Party was really expected to do. And even on the NI point, I need to point out to you that the Tories were saying before the election, employers' national insurance is going to go up. Labour never denied it. And you're right, it was a sleight of hand, if I can put it that way. But, the Tories in the last manifesto said, we're not going to raise any taxes, including national insurance. And one of the first things that Rishi Sunak did was raise national insurance. So they're not the first political party to break a manifesto pledge. And certainly, as I say, this budget was nowhere near the scare the horses moment that we had under Liz Truss. And yet you had commentators within the media who who were trying to pretend that it was.
Well, I'm sure Labour will be robust enough to deal with those commentators. But can I just
They
ask?
shouldn't have to, Jim. The point I'm making isn't political here. We keep saying on a weekly basis, trust in politics is broken. Do your profession not have a responsibility and a duty to try and help repair that?
Their first responsibility is to critique the government of the day. And it was, as I've already said, the national insurance thing was any normal person would not have thought they were putting up national insurance. Can I just ask you about national? You are an employer yourself, Frank. What do you say to the not only the increase in national insurance, but also the lowering of the level at which it's paid? If you've got 4 people, you won't pay it, but everyone employing 4 people will. What do you say to the charge that it is going to mean lower wages? So working people, which is another thing that commentators have commented on, and I think quite rightly, it's quite offensive, that expression, quite frankly, working as if bosses and other people who run care homes aren't working people. That there will be less people employed and some will be fired. And the hospitality industry in particular, which is very fragile, is going to be hit. I mean, this is one of the things that fueled what you call unhelpful commentary.
Well, it wasn't. As I say, if they'd have stayed in that lane, I'd have been quite comfortable, Jim. It was this nonsensical suggestion that the markets were unhappy and there was a run on the pack and all this nonsense. I'm not complaining about the fact that political commentators and journalists ask tough questions of our political leaders. That's what they're there to do. But making stuff up is basically the business of Elon Musk and X. It's not the business of the BBC, Sky and so on. But in terms of answering your question, I don't think there was a business person that you met on Wednesday that wasn't anticipating the increase in national insurance contributions. And I think Sean Keyes from Sutcliffe put it best when he said, OK, we've had that as the sort of downside to the budget from our perspective, because we're going to be paying more in terms of NI contributions. However, she's just announced £6 billion investment into housing. And as long as we can get that infrastructure and investment in place, then we'll be okay. It will be a balanced budget. And I think most people, and I'm not suggesting that some businesses won't be adversely affected by this budget, but that's always been the case, whichever party has been in power. But what I will say to you, Jim, is that I think most will be resilient enough to come through this. And many are saying, yeah, it's going to be tough, but you know what? It was inevitable because of that inheritance that she had.
Just finally, and then I'll let Joe in. I think you have a point that the commentariat did want to do the story about run on the pound, and it is to the Chancellor's credit that she had squared off the International Monetary Fund and a number of other people in Washington, and with all the pitch rolling that we had before the budget, which so irritated the Speaker. I think I think there's a lot in that. I'm sorry, Joe, go on.
Well, only to say that I do think, yes, absolutely, journalists must hold government and people in power, whether they're in business or whatever they do, to account and ask difficult questions. But there is a laziness in journalism, I think, that perhaps wasn't there when Jim and I started out, when we were using papyrus and quill pens. And part of that is, cut to resources in newsrooms, whether it's in local radio, local papers, or mainstream media. But what happens is it goes, for or against, and it's so linear and so ignoring the nuance. I mean, for instance, the care homes. Well, most care homes make walloping great profits, and an awful lot of them are owned and run by wealth companies, banks and investment companies. They pay the minimum wage, they employ the minimum number of people that they can get away with to meet the regulations. So the idea that they're going to have to lay off staff, no, you can cut your bloody profits, just like the water companies should. And that is never challenged. And I do think we are in danger of going, let's make something an argument because that's what the public want. Well, actually, it isn't what the public want. And I've heard more people just on the street since the budget saying, well, yeah, exactly as you said, Frank. Well, we expected to be some tough things, but these things are good things. So I think people are actually much more pragmatic and much more grown up about it than the media would perhaps treat the audience in many cases.
As I say, I'm just a bit concerned that we're going the same way as the States if we're not careful. And you just end up with media that are looking for the headline rather than looking for the story. And I think that, the commentary for this budget ought to have been, it's tough for some people, there's going to be more investment, and it was probably inevitable. And I think most people in the country have come to that view without the help of the press. If I reflect on the Labour Party and its approach to this budget and to the general election, hindsight is a wonderful thing. But I do wonder if Rachel Reeves just wishes that when Jeremy Hunt announced that whopping cut in national insurance contributions, which cost the country £20 billion, pre-election bribe, so to speak, she'd have just got up and said, well, we're not going to do that. Whether actually that would have been a better tactic. Well,
that's an interesting point, actually, isn't it? Considering the fact, and it's not particularly with hindsight, that the Tories were going to be swept from office, whether she could have given herself a bit more elbow room. The Ming vase could have been dropped a little bit, and one of those strands could have.
She boxed herself in, hadn't she, on all sorts of things, and so, as I say, that one refusal, we are not going to do that. It's mismanaging the economy. It's reckless. We're not prepared to sign up for that. That would have saved us £20 billion as a country. And of course, nobody had benefited from it in the wage packets by then. But Rachel Reeves didn't know that Rishi Sunak was going to cut and run early, so that was another consideration that she was.
Anyway, there is a source of money has been revealed by the Sunday Times and Channel 4 this weekend. I don't know if you guys have seen it. Yeah. All about these duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall, where the King and Prince William are getting huge returns. And Steve Rotherham actually features on that programme because the waterfront around the River Mersey is all part of the Crown, and he's saying the Mersey ferries apparently have to pay a toll to these rich royals. It was an excellent programme and excellent journalism there, and we'll see whether they respond, because it really hit them, because they pose as eco warriors and so on, the King particularly, and yet there was all sorts of stuff there about mining in Cornwall, which the Duchy of Cornwall is doing. As you know, I'm still a supporter of Richard III and his descendants. So that may be colouring my commentary on the on the German monarchy. But anyway, there it is. So that may be a source for Rachel. Did you fight for Richard III, Jim? I would have done if I'd been there.
Right. Well, listen, we've not really got time to get into the detail of the story that Jim has just referred to. But if you want to know more about the royals ripping us off, then go to yesterday's Sunday Times and you will see a very detailed and, as you say, Jim, very good report on all of that. So I'm going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to do the Tory leadership election, which finally concluded at the weekend, and take a brief look ahead to tomorrow's US presidential election. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. In the first part, we've reflected on the budget. At the weekend, the Conservative Party finally concluded its leadership election, and Kemi Badenoch was the ultimate winner, I'll say. She won around 51% of those votes cast, against Jenrick's 41%. I think it was somewhere in that region. So a relatively comfortable win, although closer than most recent Conservative Party leadership contests. And interestingly, 25% of what is a very, very small membership for the Conservative Party these days. Only 131,000 members now, the Tory party have. 25% of those decided not to bother voting at all. And so you've now got a leader in place. Let me remind you, the 6th Conservative Party leader in 9 years. That is an incredible statistic on its own, who faces a parliamentary party that she has only a third of support on. So the MPs vote, let me remind listeners, the final sort of 3, Cleverly, Jenrick and Badenoch, were split virtually third, a third, a third. And now you've got a Conservative Party membership, more than half of whom didn't support the new leader. She's holding together the most fragile of coalitions. And I'm not sure whether it's still 5 families, but there's still an awful lot of different groupings in and around that parliamentary party that she's got to get a grip of. And then she's also got a challenge, which Joe is going to talk us through now, of how she fills cabinet positions with loyalists, because I'm not sure she's got enough of them to even fill her shadow cabinet with. So it's a tough job. We knew it was going to be a tough job. Just to put the other side of the story in a sense, I think that they've chosen the right candidate of the 2 that they ended up with. I think she's got a bit more about her than people have given her credit for, perhaps. Although I do think she's made her first major mistake, which I'll come back to a little later. And as we've said on this podcast a number of times, Keir Starmer won't be relishing facing a Prime Minister's questions every week in the same way that he'd have, I guess, just swatted Jenrick away. So, Joe, a bit of a mixed bag there in terms of my comments, but let's come back to this challenge she has internally, because she's not got the overwhelming support that, for example, Johnson had. And I think she's going to struggle to hold this coalition of Conservatives together.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 80 shadow cabinet positions. Some of those probably won't be filled because they're junior ministerial roles, and I suspect people will be doubling up to cover the brief. But even if you only do half of that, 40, that's the entire number of MPs who voted for her. Well, you can't pack your shadow cabinet with loyalists only, because then you've got the remaining 80 sitting there plotting and scheming, which of course the Tories can't help but do, and they'll be doing that anyway. So she has got a bit of a problem, and of course the sort of, if you like to call them the big beasts like Jeremy Hunt and James Cleverly, are going to the backbenches. They don't want to be in a shadow cabinet, and I dare say some of them might decide to go before the end of this Parliament. So she has got a challenge. You're absolutely right, Frank. She has already, put her foot in it with her usual unthought through comments about Partygate, which I'll let you talk about in a minute. I do think it's important to recognise, here is a woman who, although she was born in this country, grew up mainly in Nigeria. She has, gone through a glass ceiling like an explosion as the first black woman leader of the Tory party. And, there will be many people, quite rightly, in the Labour Party saying, we haven't even had a woman leader, never mind a black one. And also it's important to note, in the interests of fairness and balance, that you two actually got your betting odds right for once. And there might be a hope that Jim's favourite for Tory leadership, Mel Stride, might come back as some sort of shadow cabinet position. But I think, you're absolutely right, Frank. She's got a job on her hands to hold together this, it's not a family, it's a gathering of people that have been stuck in a village hall because it's been rather damp, I think. And she is very right wing, and she will inevitably, I think, try and take on reform more than look at why did they lose the election, why did they get it wrong. And that, as we've all said for weeks, is what they've got to do. They've got to start from basics and go, okay, what went wrong and how do we fix it? And you don't fix it by just chasing Nigel Farage over to the right.
No, I think, to be fair to her, she did resist the commitment to come out of the ECHR, which Jenrick obviously hung his hat on and thought was going to deliver him the vote of the membership. So I think there's two things I'd take from that. Firstly, she's smarter than him. And secondly, the membership are more pragmatic than we give them credit for. Because again, I think all of us in the back of our minds were saying, will an elderly, and it is an elderly, shrinking Conservative membership really vote for a black female leader? Well, they did. And as I say, there was an awful lot of people who abstained. My guess, though, is that most of those abstentions came from what we would generally describe as one nation Tories who didn't feel as though they could support either candidate. So it wasn't necessarily, we're not voting for Kemi Badenoch because she's a black woman. It was just basically, we're not voting for Kemi Badenoch because of her politics, and that's
they probably would have voted for James Cleverly had
they voted for Cleverly.
Had the shenanigans around borrowing votes not gone disastrously wrong.
Yeah. So I think that credit to the Tory party that they have broken that glass ceiling. I mean, we should all celebrate that. And it was interesting to see Keir Starmer making that statement immediately after she was elected to congratulate her and say, isn't it fantastic that the UK has got its first senior black politician in terms of a leader. So, Jim, what do you make of the results? As Joe's just said there, I wasn't going to brag, but you and I did get that right last week. I mean, we got the previous 5 predictions wrong, but even a stock clock's right twice a day, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, that the Conservative membership, because we had a fairly lively discussion the other week about whether they should be consulted at all, but that they have at first instance shown wisdom in electing the more pragmatic of the candidates, rather than in 1997, where they went for a series of right-wingers first. Just on this business of her identity, she's very keen not to go on and on about this business about her racial identity and her gender, and she wants to move on. But it's not for discussion today. But it does present a huge challenge for who the next Labour leader is going to be after the succession of women and people of ethnic origin leading the Conservative Party, which it just seems the wrong way around politically. But that's not being fair to the Conservatives. I think my comments would be that I think she will test, Prime Minister's questions is extremely important. And, Starmer is not the most fleet of foot. And I think she could be quite energetic at Prime Minister's questions. Whether it'll do her any good or not, as we previously discussed, it didn't do Hague any good against Blair, although he was very good against Blair. But she's also got the fact at the moment that the government hasn't had a great start, has had a controversial budget. So, there's a lot for her to go at. I do think the fact that Cleverly's not said he won't serve is a bit worrying, to be honest. I mean, I know it would have been difficult, but in the spirit of unity, and unity is going to be such an important thing. I think he should have offered himself to serve alongside her and could help her with bringing the party together. My last comment is that the best way in which they will get unity and stop caballing against each other is electoral momentum. Next May, we have the county council elections, which is traditionally a good territory for the Conservatives in this round of the elections. And if they can do well in the local elections and any by-elections that come up, we don't at this stage know because of police investigations whether Frodsham and Helsby is going to be one such, but we have to park that for the moment. But if she can get that sort of momentum, then people who might have differences and want to argue about the ECHR and all that sort of stuff, as Wilson said, keep the stagecoach rolling forward and everyone stays on board. So that's going to be her first target, is to do well in the county council elections next year.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a number of commentators were saying over the weekend, had Labour got off to a bit of a flying start, it may not necessarily have done her any harm, because she's coming in now with the Tories actually ahead in the polls. So she's not really going to get any credit if that continues to be the case. But I take your point, Jim. A good performance at the elections in May would certainly help her in terms of trying to keep that fractious party together. I just think that, a bit like the Labour Party in the 80s, there's that many different groupings that you wonder how anyone can navigate through them. And yeah, I think she's got a hell of a task on. I would still be surprised, as I wrote in my blog last week, that if she led the party into the next election as the leader of the opposition. We'll see. And just going back to that point I made briefly, she's already dropped, I think, a first bollock, which was to go on to the Koonsberg show yesterday and think that Partygate wasn't that big a deal. And again, we went through some of the comments that people who I'd spoken to in Parliament last week were making about Kemi Badenoch, most of which were positive, I have to say. But they did say that for a Tory, and for this Tory party in particular, they did feel she was out of touch with ordinary people. And that comment was absolutely out of touch with what people in the country think. If she doesn't think and understand how pissed off people were with those parties, then she really is out of touch with ordinary people. I had a woman I was talking to last week who, the first thing she said, I'll never forgive Boris Johnson for Partygate. I didn't see my mum. My mum passed away during that period of time. This cuts deep. And if she doesn't quickly start to understand and become a bit more instinctive in terms of the way the electorate is thinking, then it could be an even shorter tenure than I'm anticipating. So she's got to get that sort of mindset right. I think the other thing I'd say is that in terms of this shadow cabinet, there are some good people that I think will emerge. You know, she's got Coutinho, I think, will be a star of the future. She's going to have to find a place for Jenrick. I'm not sure where. I don't think he's a good politician. You know, this isn't just because I don't like his politics. I think I think he comes across as the archetypal Tory boy. And he's not the sort of guy that you'd necessarily want to put up front. But I think she will have to give him a big job. Priti Patel, I guess, will come back in some role. Maybe not in the shadow cabinet, though. Maybe as chairman of the party. And the key role she's already appointed to. She's appointed a female chief whip. Now, I don't know anything about the woman that she's appointed, but that is going to be a critical role, isn't it, in Parliament? We know how important the whips are. So, yeah, a very, very tough task ahead for her. And, you know, I think she will make a reasonably good fist the first few months. I think she'll have some goodwill behind her. But there's too many in that party, I think, guys, who will be desperate for her to trip. And then as these by-elections emerge, there's going to be some other people coming in who will have their eyes on the prize. And it won't be a place in the shadow cabinet. It'll be taking over the leadership.
Yeah.
I put a marker down for I'd put a marker down for a woman called Alicia Cairns. She's a sort of Foreign Office
well, she was chair of the Foreign Defence.
That's right. Yeah,
yeah, she's very good.
When I was in the gallery, you know, just after the downtown reception, I was watching her, and I think she's one to watch as well. You know, yes, there will be some, but I don't think they're going to cover all the places, Joe. I don't think they'll shadow every single Undersecretary of State. They'll bunch them together rather than having disloyalists on the front bench.
Well, of course, if I was Kemi Badenoch, the person I would be looking over my shoulder for is Mrs. Jenrick, because I don't know if you saw the footage of when the result was announced. And she, who is supposedly a very ambitious woman and a very forceful woman who has, you know, propelled Bobby, to the failure that he perhaps so rightly deserved. But her face was like thunder. White face, black eye makeup, absolute fury, and then suddenly realized that the camera was on her. She looked around panic-stricken and started clapping. And if I was Kemi, I'd think, right, that one I need to watch. I'll invite her around for a cup of tea at some point.
keep your friends close and your enemies closer still. Yeah, as I say, I think, you know, it was going to be a hell of a task for anyone who took that job on. And the final point I'd make here is that, and again, this comes from a Conservative mate of mine, not my personal comment, She was the best of the six, but the best of a bad bunch.
Yeah.
And, wouldn't surprise anyone, I don't think, if within the next 2-3 years there was a challenge made against her, or she's got this in her locker, apparently, to just say, oh, piss off, fed up with this, and just sort of throw her toys out of the pram and walk away from it. So, listen, congratulations to Kemi Badenoch. It's a job that not many of us would relish, but we wish her all the very best in it, I'm sure. Right, the big job that is up for grabs comes tomorrow, of course, in the American presidential election. And we've got Donald Trump against Kamala Harris. It's been well trailed now that they're running neck and neck as far as the polls are concerned. I'm going to ask you a little bit of a left field question. Do we think the pollsters in America are being overly cautious and just don't want to call this thing because of the trouble that they've gotten themselves into in the past, underestimating Trump's vote particularly, but on this occasion just maybe underestimating the women's vote in the States? Joe?
I don't know. I mean, there was some stuff in the papers over the weekend about Trump's lot, the Republicans, already gearing up for legal challenges, and those legal challenges are going to be based on polling that shows it's so close. So he's going to go, how could I not win when all the polls showed? Now, I don't know enough about American polling rules and things, but my understanding is that a lot of this is paid for party polling, as opposed to YouGov or Gallup or any of the other ones like that. So we don't know, I don't think, enough about the weighting and the quantitative what's the names, that's a technical term, by the way. So I don't know, so it could work the other way. Are they being too cautious, or are they overestimating Donald Trump's likelihood of victory? I mean, whatever happens, I don't think it's going to be an astonishing, emphatic win for either of them. I'm sure it's going to be quite close.
Jim, what's your view on these polls? Are they accurate, or are they a bit frit? And let's go back to the media. I'm talking about the media in the UK. The Washington Post failing to endorse a candidate. I heard Bob Woodward spitting feathers about that fact. Again, for listeners who are probably not as au fait with American politics as we are, Bob Woodward was the journalist along with, who's his colleague's name, Jim? Woodward and Bernstein, who uncovered the Watergate affair, the President Nixon scandal, and was at the Washington Post at the time, very courageous to report that particular issue back in the 70s. And their publisher, Bezos, who owns Amazon, decided 9 days out from the election that for the first time in an awfully long time, the Washington Post wasn't going to endorse a candidate. So my suggestion to you is that you've got pollsters who, as Joe said, are being paid by the Trump camp, so are overestimating his vote. You've got other pollsters who are a bit fearful that in the past they underscored Trump's support, and so are overestimating that in terms of their tweaks to the polling that they're doing. And it might not be quite as close a race as we think, but ultimately what it does tell us is that people are genuinely scared of Donald Trump, including the Washington Post.
Yes, well, just on the Washington Post thing, I think it plays into this general fear I have about the whole thing, that you've got this guy, Donald Trump, who's deeply disrespectful of the Constitution, has made the most ghastly comments in the last few days. Indeed, there was one Republican on this morning saying that Trump was quite good in closing out in 2016 and 2020. He remained very focused and closed out well, whereas this time he's become more and more deranged, saying about putting guns in the face of Mrs. Cheney and all that sort of stuff. But so you've got this guy who's openly threatening to go after his opponents afterwards, and then you've got Bezos, who's clearly wants to hedge his bets and doesn't want to offend him. And this is this. I mean, I don't want to overdo this sort of 1930s Germany thing, but you get the beginning of this where the politician is fanatical, the press is cowed, and then what are the military going to do? What and you start to begin to get into that area, and I'm not exaggerating, because there are hundreds of lawyers lined up on both sides, actually, ready to start contesting this thing. And of course, the longer uncertainty goes on, that's a vacuum, a dangerous vacuum. And the country's full of guns, as we know. I don't want, heaven forbid, that all this should come to pass, but we are in pretty dangerous territory. On the polls, this is quite a sophisticated thing, and my first instinct when you said, "Oh, the polls are doing this and that," I was going to say to you, "Well, the polls are the polls. Whatever the polls come up with, the pollsters have no control over." But of course, you are right that they are tweaked to try and deal with, shy voters or people they can't contact and things like that. So you may be right. The one last thing I want to say, of course, is this Ohio poll. Now, Ohio is not meant to be in play, but Iowa, I beg your pardon, but a very well-respected pollster in Iowa, apparently, has a good reputation, has come up with this Harris lead in Iowa. Which sort of suggests it might be leaning to what you're saying, Frank, that the polls are sort of trying to say, "Oh, we underestimated the Trump vote last time, so we're trying to level it up a bit," and therefore giving the appearance of a dead heat. And maybe Ohio is telling us the truth, that actually Harris is out in front, which she needs to be, as we previously discussed. If they're not don't have a lead of about 4 or 5 points, the Democrats, for complicated reasons with the college, they don't win.
Yeah, the Democrats are going to have to up for the fight, because there is going to be a legal challenge if Trump loses. And ballot boxes were on fire last week in a Democrat stronghold. It's scary, actually, to look at the mess that America is in. And you would really be in total and utter despair if it was the first time it had happened. But if you go back to 1968, America then was on the precipice of civil war. Listening to a fantastic series at the moment on another podcast channel, The Rest is History, who are looking back at 68 and some of the things that were happening then. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, you had the Vietnam protests, and you really felt as though it was a country on fire. And you look at the comparisons that these guys are making in terms of today, and you can see why that comparison is being made. However, my real concern is that the checks and balances, the guardrails, were still in place then for Nixon. And so you talk about the Washington Post uncovering Watergate. If Watergate happened now, Trump basically has a pass. Because of the Supreme Court ruling recently, which says presidents can't do anything wrong. So, I take, as I say, some comfort from the fact that America has been here before to an extent. But those guardrails, those parameters that presidents had in the past simply have gone. And he's totally hijacked the Republican Party. And again, I use the word frit about Bezos. But I think his own party are scared of him, aren't they? There are people who 4 years ago, like McConnell, for example, who should have been trying to put him in jail then, who are now sort of kowtowing to the bastard again. It's a really dangerous place, I think, America at the moment. And as I say, I hope Jim, you're right, the Democrats are lawyered up, but I hope that they've got the bottle for the fight, because the Republicans certainly will have.
Well, before we started this podcast, you reminded us of Al Gore. And this is in 2000, where it was it was all fairly benign in a way. It was these things called hanging chads. It was where you punched a hole to indicate your vote, and there were doubts about these hanging chads in the key state of Florida, and it went on for weeks and eventually went to the Supreme Court. I haven't read, there is a definitive book on this, but I think you may have read it or something, because you were hinting that Gore, eventually Gore said, you know what, let's call it a day, when he should have pursued it.
Gore conceded very early, and then it was reversed.
Then he retracted it, yeah.
And then obviously by then the momentum had been lost. So the lesson for Harris is to, for me, be as, and this is again the problem that the Democrats have, isn't it? Hillary Clinton was accused of being overconfident. And now you've got the Democrats who are saying, oh, well, it's too close to call. Trump and Trumpians are out there saying we've won this thing, in order to give the impression, as Joe referenced, that if it is close, well, it can't be that close. This is an absolute fix. And I think it's so much easier, isn't it, for populists to play this game.
Apparently, Trump will claim victory within hours, perhaps even before the last polls have closed. He will say, "I have won," and then the narrative is all placed in because the way the military votes and so on are counted. Sometimes the Republicans are in leads, which are caught up with by the Democrats for all sorts of technical reasons. But of course, it will then play into his narrative. Oh, look at them! I've won the election, but look, these mystery votes are coming in. You can see what he's going to try and do.
It's I think it's squeaky bum time actually for the whole world, and I think 76 million people have already voted, which these figures are enormous, and here we sit week after week talking about our tiny little island and the tiny number of votes and all of that sort of stuff. So 76 million people have already voted. That's more than half of the total number of people who voted in its entirety last time round. And we've got no idea. I do think one thing is quite clear, that I think if Kamala Harris wins, it will be because women have gone out to vote, and that's on the issue of abortion. And I think that is very significant, or could be very significant.
Well, we don't have long to wait to find out. Probably only 3 or 4 months. It's probably going to be a bit like the Tory leadership election. It'll be, it is one way you can look at this is that, look, if Trump wins, it's going to be a disaster for Ukraine. It's going to be a disaster, I think, for NATO potentially. Yeah. It could accelerate the EU and UK reset that us guys would so much like to see. And one of the things I should have mentioned in the first part of the programme, actually, in terms of the budget, I do wonder whether Rachel Reeves and the government have one eye on improving the trade and relationships with the European Union, because the thing that is killing our economy more than anything else, whether we talk about austerity, whether we talk about Liz Truss, whether we talk about lack of investment, 4% a year. And these are the figures from the OBR, who everybody likes to quote these days. They are seen as the Bible on economic statistics. 4% a year our economy is shrinking because of Brexit. So if you're looking for an upside to a Trump win, then maybe, as I say, the acceleration of a much better relationship with the EU would be on the cards, because, of course, in the area of defence, the UK is still seen as a world leader. So it might encourage the French to stop talking about fish. Anyway, on that note, we are going to try and get our American correspondent, Martin Littrot, who is out in Florida at the moment, to join us for a special edition of the Downtown Zen Politics podcast, the Downtown Zen Politics podcast US, we'll call it, given that that's what other podcasts do. So we're going to try and get Martin with us Thursday or Friday, see how the results pan out tomorrow, to see what's worth discussing and when. And we're hoping that Jim and Joe can join us as well. So listen out for that special emergency podcast on the US election. But for now, from Jim, from Joe, from myself, have a great week. And if you do have a vote in the States, cast it wisely and cast it for Harris. See you soon.